During the 1960s, the FBI spied on Martin Luther King and other civil rights protesters. The FBI spied on Vietnam War protesters. The Church Committee was formed in the 1970s and detailed these abuses. And the response by Congress was to pass something called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. FISA was ostensibly passed to limit spying on Americans. It was supposed to be a reform. But as far as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act allows government to spy on U.S. citizens without a warrant, it is unconstitutional. As Dr. John Tyler from Houston Christian University points out, the FISA text, the Constitution's text, and the relevant opinions by the U.S. Supreme Court conclusively demonstrate that FISA and its secret ex parte, meaning you only hear from one side in the court, these courts are unconstitutional for three reasons. First, the secret ex parte courts violate the case or controversy requirement of Article 3. Courts are about deciding disputes between two parties. They aren't originated just to say, this is a pronouncement, there has to be a dispute. And in the FISA court, it's more about having a generalized comment. Second, FISA violates the Fourth Amendment liberties from unreasonable searches and seizures. Third, FISA and its secret ex parte courts violate the due process guarantees of the Fifth and the 14th Amendment. Dr. Tyler goes on to say that lastly, the Supreme Court has ruled that national security does not require secret courts or justify ignoring the Fourth Amendment liberties. This unconstitutional government spying has been further authorized by adding Section 702 to FISA. That law entrusts America's intelligence agencies with broad authorities, supposedly to surveil foreigners abroad. But time has proven again and again that America's intelligence agencies cannot be trusted with this immense power and responsibility. Section 702 expires at the end of this year. We've known this for 5 years, and yet somehow the Senate has no time to debate this and wishes to simply extend it. Members of Congress anticipated using this deadline as an opportunity not just to make meaningful changes, but to reform FISA generally to better protect American civil liberties. But it doesn't appear to be allowed to happen at this point. Everything's rush, rush, rush. Let's pass it without debate. But they've known for 5 years it was going to expire at the end of this year, and yet they just want to punt it with the hope that they'll never have to debate it. Extending this Section 702 robs Congress of the ability to make reforms now and likely robs Congress of the opportunity to make reforms anytime in the next year. That means that once again, the intelligence agencies that ignore the constraints on their power will go unaddressed and unpunished. And the warrantless surveillance of Americans in violation of the Bill of Rights will continue. Using 702, Americans' communications, content, and metadata is inevitably swept up and kept in government databases without a warrant. Law enforcement agencies then access Americans' communications, once again, without a warrant. In other words, your texts, your emails, your phone calls are collected into this massive government database without a warrant and then searched willy-nilly by thousands of different employees without a warrant. As Judge Andrew Napolitano points out, the Constitution requires probable cause of a crime to be demonstrated to a judge before a judge grants a warrant. That was the law of the land until FISA. But now FISA has set up a special court that meets in secret, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and it authorizes judges on that court to issue search warrants based on a lower standard of probable cause. The Fourth Amendment says you have to prove to a judge probable cause of a crime. This says you only have to prove probable cause of an association with a foreign entity. This is contrary to the Constitution. This is not the Fourth Amendment. The Constitution requires that warrants be issued on probable cause that a crime has been committed. But as Judge Napolitano makes clear, FISA established probable cause of foreign agency. So he lowered the standard, and it's not probable cause of a crime, but it's probable cause of association with a foreign agency. But even that standard morphed down into probable cause of speaking to a foreign person, which then again morphed even further down to probable cause of speaking to any person who has ever spoken to a foreign person. All of that happened in secret and without congressional approval. With this weakened standard to order surveillance, these FISA judges who meet in secret grant 99.97% of all warrants. They're a rubber stamp for whatever they want to do. The left-leaning Brennan Center for Justice further explains why a law designed to protect the Fourth Amendment has led to their dissolution. The Brennan Center states, dramatic shifts in technology and law have changed the role of the FISA court since its creation in 1978. The fundamental changes not only erode America's civil liberties, but they likely violate Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which limits courts to deciding concrete disputes between parties rather than issuing opinion on abstract questions. According to the Brennan Center, today's FISA court doesn't operate like a court at all, but more like an arm of the intelligence establishment. The FISA court's wholesale approval process also fails to satisfy standards set forth by the Fourth Amendment, which protects against warrantless searches and seizures. Some people issued prescient warnings about the destruction of civil liberties and constitutional rights at the time. At the time, then Senator Joe Biden stated that he was voting no on this Section 702, this expansion of FISA powers. Senator Joe Biden said it would be a breathtaking and unconstitutional expansion of the president's powers, and it is wholly unnecessary to address the problems the administration has identified. Then Senator Biden added that he would not give the president unchecked authority to eavesdrop on whomever he wants in exchange for the vague and hollow assurances that he will protect the civil liberties of the American people. Boy, I wish that Joe Biden were still around and remembering his comments about FISA. Patrick Eddington of the Cato Institute has dedicated his career to exposing the abuses of surveillance authorities. He argues that Section 702 of FISA and its predecessors comprise the biggest unconstitutional mass surveillance dragnet in American history, and that we have documentary evidence from the federal government's own records of repeated systemic abuses of this authority. Even the FISA court itself in 2018 held that the FBI's procedures for accessing Americans' communications that are incidentally collected under 702 violate both the statute and the Fourth Amendment. Even the FISA court, which rubber stamps these warrants like there's no going away, says that they believe that they are violating the Fourth Amendment. But these warrantless surveillance on Americans goes on. In 2021 alone, the FBI conducted 3.4 million warrantless searches of Americans' communications. Like the spying on Martin Luther King and Vietnam War protesters, the FBI still targets individuals for their beliefs. The FBI accessed the 702 database without search warrants to access the information of 19,000 political donors. They accessed the records of those involved with the protest on January 6th. They accessed the records of a member of Congress and Black Lives Matters activist. You might think, oh, I've got nothing to hide, no big deal. You might think that if you avoid political activity, you can avoid the long arm of the government. But think again. If you call a merchant in England or text a family member in Germany or email a friend in Israel, the feds can seize and search your communications without permission, without a warrant, and without due process. But that's not all. The federal spies can then capture all the communications of the person you subsequently reached out to and all the persons they reached out to. It goes on and reaches its tentacles out such that it gathers millions of communications. Imagine a senator or a congressman who talks to a prime minister overseas. Their communications in the database. To allow this to happen, imagine all of the people who are international business that make international phone calls. Their phone calls are in the database. And it'd be one thing if we were just collecting this to look at terrorist activity, but no, we let the FBI search any American's name in there. They can go in there under any pretext. We told the FBI, you have to list why you're searching the name, and they didn't do it. They actually go around some of the rules by saying, oh, let's search 10,000 things and call it one query. We cannot trust them. You cannot trust the fox to be in charge of the hen house. We need controls, and Congress needs to do their job. We had 5 years to think about this. It comes up, and we're just going to airdrop it in and say, sorry, we haven't had time to think about this. We don't have time to reform it. We don't care about Americans' privacy. That's what the majority who will vote to just drop this in and turn the other way will do. It'd be bad enough if the FBI limited itself to eviscerating the Fourth Amendment and indiscriminately collecting and searching the private communications of millions of Americans, but it's far worse than that. As we all know, the FBI abused the immense power conferred by FISA to subvert a Republican presidential campaign. In its zeal to investigate whether Carter Page, a foreign policy advisor to the candidate Trump, the FBI sought to obtain permission to conduct electronic surveillance on Page, not by going to a real judge in public in an Article III court, by going to a secret judge. Imagine the chilling effect. If you can try to get beyond the politics of whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, imagine the chilling effect of the government investigating political campaigns. How could anybody think that that's a good idea? To eavesdrop on Page, the FBI needed to get approval from the FISA court, not a real warrant, but just a warrant that he was associated with a foreign government. The secretive court that grants 99.97% of warrants gave it to him. But the FBI also relied on information they were given by the Trump's opponent's campaign, the Hillary Clinton's campaign. You have something called the Steele dossier that was all over the news. That dossier was given to the FBI by a political campaign. It was essentially opposition research. Clinton's presidential campaign and the Democrat Party obtained the secret surveillance order by subterfuge. But the FBI didn't verify or check the claims made in the dossier as they're required to do by law. To put it in plain English, the FBI was able to spy on an American citizen because it presented the Democrat Party's opposition research as evidence to obtain a secret order on a campaign operative. This was fraud. This was an abuse of power. This was an attempt to undermine a Republican presidential campaign. People talk about election interference. My goodness. What could be more of an interference in a campaign than getting a secret order from your intelligence agencies to spy on a political campaign? The order was ultimately found to be misleading. And you would think this would have led to scandal. You would think this would have led to punishment. But no one really was ever punished for this. Even the New York Times described the effort to wiretap Carter Page as a staggeringly dysfunctional and error-ridden process. But these are not errors. These are not honest mistakes. These are abuses of power. The audacity to dupe and manipulate the secret FISA court demonstrates that the misconduct were not mere accidents, but rather demonstrates the arrogance that inevitably results when a secretive, one-sided process all but assures these agencies will never be challenged. And what are we doing? The Senate will sweep this under the rug. We will have no reform. They've known for 5 years this is coming up, and they're not going to do a thing to reform it. Since the FBI demonstrated a willingness to evade the rules to spy on and aid to a presidential candidate, we should not be surprised that Carter Page was far from the only victim of the abuse of FISA authorities. A subsequent Department of Justice review reviewed 29 other FISA applications and found that each one contained factual discrepancies and errors at an average of 20 mistakes per application. More recently, Special Counsel John Durham reported on the FBI's probe into the alleged collusion between Donald Trump and Russia, revealed that at least some FBI agents abused America's surveillance apparatus to open a groundless counterintelligence campaign against a Republican presidential candidate. And yet, despite the abuses, despite the years of calls for reform, the Senate is presented with a defense bill that continues the status quo. In 5 years, they've had no time to debate this because they don't want to. They want to rubber stamp this, and they want to look the other way. Not one reform is included in this conference report that would address the neglect of the Bill of Rights. Rather, the only thing this conference report ignores is the long record of abuse of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is no mere limitation of government power. The Fourth Amendment is fundamental to the concept of American liberty. Today, the elected representatives of our country, whose founders overthrew a king who claimed a mandate from heaven to rule his empire, cannot muster the courage to tell its own law enforcement agencies that we will not tolerate the evisceration of the Bill of Rights nor the destruction of our electoral process. Why would any senator vote to waive this point of order? How can you look your constituents in the eye and justify your vote to empower government at the expense of America's individual rights? Do not fall for the hollow and cynical retorts from the other side who inevitably argue that the world is on fire. Those who make the lazy and predictable argument that government is your only shield from threats always fail to mention that government itself is often the threat. I think it's high time we quit letting fear overrun our constitutional duty. The members of this body should do themselves the honor of standing by their oath to the Constitution. To protect our civil liberties and the integrity of the Congressional Conference Committee process, we must strip this extension of domestic spying authority out of the defense bill.